yet another Namco arcade classic, this time Galaga, or Galaga if you're weird. This was not the very first space shooter of its kind. There was Space Invaders in the late 70s, and even before that there was probably something else. But Galaga and Space Invaders basically innovated the shoot 'em up, shmup genre. And I'm going to give it a little try. I'm going to give it a little playthrough. This is a game that I was not familiar with as a kid. I don't know that I played any version of Galaga at all as a child. Not until my teens. It wasn't in a lot of arcades that I saw as a kid. I'm sure I saw it, but I just didn't recognize it. I never played it. I never sat and watched the attract mode and pretended to play it. Fuck. I just, it was there, but I wasn't aware of it if it was. But Galaga was another hit for Namco. Namco churned out the fucking hits in the early to mid 80s. Galaga was not as big a hit as Pac-Man, although what was, but it was still a fairly big hit for them. It still got ported to a lot of home computers, shit, and fucking, home video game systems like the NES later on in the 80s, etc. I don't remember whether it was ported to the Atari 2600, but I would believe it. If it wasn't, I'm sure it was on the 5200 or the 7800 later on. And, yeah, the basic setup of Galaga, again, is pretty simple. It was pretty advanced for its time. It kind of took the basic Space Invader premise of you being a ship at the bottom of the screen and alien invaders attacking from the top, but as you can see, it made it more complex. It kind of elaborated on that concept. The aliens have much more complex patterns. They fly around instead of just going back and forth and dropping slowly from the top of the screen to the bottom. And so you had to adjust for a lot of this stuff. And a lot of later shooter games, like 1943, and, Aero Fighters, and a lot of those famous, especially like these, like vertical scrolling shooters, they all take their cues from Galaga and its, the other Namco space shooter hit, Galaxian. And, Jesus Christ. Shots fired, number of hits. See, it kept track of some nice stats for such an early game. Give it a second try. And, I didn't even really try shoot-em-ups as a kid that much. Like, my first shoot-em-up experience was the Atari 2600 we had Space Invaders for it. And I was really little and had no fucking idea what was going on. It was too hard for me to play, so I barely played it that much. The other game we had that I played a lot, actually, technically was also a shooter, Astro Blast, where you didn't really fight enemies, you just had to shoot a bunch of asteroids that were falling very quickly from the top of the screen to the bottom. It was a similar concept, just kind of more panic mode, not so much having to deal with patterns. And then, when I had the NES, I used to rent games, and whoa, look at that, see, shit's getting a little crazy, it's getting a little complex. Doing better, though. I rented a couple of shooter games on the NES in my day, like Stinger, which is related to the Twin Bee games from, I think, Hudson Soft? Maybe not Hudson Soft, but maybe it's Taito. And I also rented the Sega, they had a port of the Sega classic Fantasy Zone, and that was fucking hard. But again, I didn't play a ton of shooters until my teens. I think there were a couple in the arcades, like 1942 or 3, I played a bit in the arcade, and thought that was kind of neat. And there was another game at Pizza Hut for a while called Ghost Pilot, which was pretty cool. I used to watch that and play it whenever I had a quarter. But in general, I didn't have a huge experience with shoot-em-ups until into my teens and adulthood, where I got to love them, And fuck you. Back in, you know, whenever this came out, 1981, early 80s, 82, thereabouts. As you can see, like, this is not a bullet hell, is the term that would be invented later on. I'm not even sure that I would term something like 1943 a bullet hell. I don't think the bullet hell shooters really started until the 90s, and those were shoot-em-ups like this, except there were a lot more enemies on screen, and more importantly, there was just the difficulty became that you had to deal with an insane hail of fucking bullets that would just torrent down on you. Fuck. But back then, it was enough that you had to deal with. The challenge in this game isn't really avoiding the lasers so much as it is dealing with all these crazy alien enemy patterns, you know. And honestly, you know, this is similar to Pac-Man in that it still holds up today. These alien Galaga invader creatures are still, you know, cute but cool. They have their own little personalities. And fuck. You know, game over, bro. Game over, man. But, you know, it was a complex game for its time. It was innovative, and it definitely was not the grandfather of shooters, which would be Space Invaders, but it was the fucking great uncle. It was the great uncle of space shooters, or just shmups in general. Fua. And there you go. Classic Namco action. See you next time.